These videos simply provide a presentation in video format of the book, Predator at the Chessboard by Ward Farnworth. The book is freely available online at http://www.chesstactics.org. White to move. What is the best move? Ganging up on the pinned piece. The beauty of using a pawn to attack a pinned piece is that the protection the pinned piece enjoys becomes irrelevant. Your opponent can't afford to trade one of his pieces for a pawn. But what if you have no such pawns available for the purpose? Then you go after the pinned target with pieces and the question becomes one of comparative might. All hangs on whether you can bring more force to bear against the pinned piece than your opponent can match with defensive reinforcements. Thus your first thought upon pinning a piece, if you can't take it with a pawn, is to count how many times it's protected and attacked and how many times it can be protected and attacked if both sides mobilize as fast as possible. Often this involves creative ways of getting pieces into position, perhaps by exchanging the pinned piece for another, where the trade has the side effect of making room for another piece you can use to attack the position. In the simple example on the left, White's queen already pins Black's rook on f7. The rook is protected by its king, so queen takes rook won't do. Can White apply more pressure against the rook? Not with a pawn, but with a piece. He plays rook moves to b7, and now the pinned target is attacked twice and guarded just once. Black has no way to add protection to the rook, his queen can't get to the 7th rank without being taken by White's rook. The rook on f7 is overmatched, and is lost next move. So that's the analysis of the pin. But in truth White can do even better than taking the rook. He can deliver mate. After 1. Rook moves to b7, there are various things Black might do, but he can't prevent White from playing queen moves to g8, and can't escape the mating net that results. If Black starts with 1. Black pawn from g5 takes at f4, don't forget that White can use b pawn from e3 takes at f4 as a resource later in the sequence. Of course the pin still is important, because that is what freezes the f7 rook into place in the beginning and so allows White to get his own rook into the action. Black to move. What is the best move? The pin already is in place, this time of White's rook by Black's bishop. The rook is protected once as well as attacked once, but since the bishop that exerts the pin is worth less than the targeted rook, it is possible for Black to simply play bishop takes rook, winning the exchange after Black recaptures. Possible, but not optimal. Much better is to try to take the pinned piece cleanly by coming after it a second time. Thus if black plays rook moves to f2, white's rook is attacked twice and protected only once, and white has no way to add more protection. The white rook gets taken on the next move, and black can't afford to recapture. Black wins a piece rather than just the exchange. The point of the position is that even where the pinning piece profitably can take the pinned piece, piling on superior force against the target sometimes is the better course, leading to a decisive gain rather than just to a favorable trade. Incidentally, note that black had two ways to add pressure with his rook: rook moves to f2, but also rook moves to b3. What's wrong with rook moves to b3? It allows white to add protection to his rook with king moves to g2, a move not possible if black's rook is on f2. Moral: when you have more than one way to add pressure to a piece, think about how your decision will affect the choices available to your opponent. White to move. What is the best move? A scan of the black king's lines again turns up a pin already in place, of black's rook, by white's queen. But the pin is imperfect because the rook is guarded once and attacked once. White has no other pieces he can use to put immediate pressure on the rook. Bishop moves to f4 fails to queen takes bishop. When you seem to be out of resources, however, consider exchanges and their consequences. Here queen takes rook leads to queen takes queen, and now white imposes a fresh pin with bishop moves to d4, as the bishop gets protection against the pinned black queen from the pawn on c3. Be mindful of the possibility this position illustrates, the ability of the pinning piece to initiate useful exchanges. White to move. What is the best move? The idea here will be familiar from the other positions in this chapter, but we'll talk it through from scratch. Sometimes a little knot of pieces that attack each other like those in the middle of the board here can seem confusing. Just take it apart with first principles. First, glance at the black king's lines and notice the pin of black's rook by white's queen, then methodically diagnose the pin and its prospects. A first question about almost any pinned piece is whether you can attack it more times than it's defended. Here the pinned rook is attacked once and defended once, so ask whether white can attack it again. Since the target is on a light squared diagonal, white could add an attacker by playing his f3 bishop to g4. But this doesn't work because then black can play queen takes queen. After white recaptures knight takes queen, black moves his rook to safety. The point: white's bishops can't be swung into action against the rook so easily, it is doing important work on f3. The problem for white is that black's queen not only guards the pinned piece but attacks the pinning piece. For white to get anywhere he therefore will have to work with violent, forcing moves that don't give black time to exchange queens and destroy the pin. When in doubt, consider exchanges. Here the only piece white can use to perform a capture is his queen. He has queen takes rook, check. And then what comes after black recaptures queen takes queen? Bishop moves to d5, which takes advantage after all of the bishop's ability to travel the light squares. This pins and then wins black's queen with support from the knight on c3. It's another example of a recurring principle. If you are stuck for ways to bring more firepower down on a pinned piece, consider taking it and ask whether doing so would free the way for you to bring in more reinforcements. Another way to put the point is that white does have two pieces he can use to attack the pinned position here, it's just that he just needs to use them to attack sequentially rather than simultaneously. White to move. What is the best move? Look at the black king's position and you see a pin of the bishop on e8 by white's rook, but no way to take advantage of it since it is guarded once and there is no immediate way to call in another attacker against it. So again, initiate an exchange with the pinning piece. Imagine 1. Rook takes bishop, queen takes rook, and now a renewed scan of the black king and its lines, and of white's offensive resources, turns up a new pin to impose. Rook moves to e8, paralyzing the queen and winning it next move. Since the queen is being pinned, white needs protection for his rook, and gets it from the bishop on h4. This sequence is the payoff of the fine coordination of white's pieces. He effectively starts with 3 of them all trained on, or occupying, d8, he owns that square, and now you see one of the possibilities such ownership can create. Pieces can attack from there and then can be replaced by the other pieces that back them up. White to move. What is the best move? Scan out from the black king and you see that the knight on d7 is pinned. Size up the impediments to exploiting the situation. The knight is attacked twice and guarded twice, and white has no immediate way to bring more power to bear against it. What to do? Consider replacing the target with an exchange and ask what would then become possible. Sometimes exchanges simplify the board and so clear the way to bring in reinforcements. We have been looking at exchanges initiated by the pinning piece, but this time let's do it a little differently, starting with 1. Rook takes knight, rook takes rook. The pinned piece has been replaced, and the new piece still is attacked once, by the pinning bishop, and guarded once, by the king. But this time white has cleared a way to bring in backup. Our pawn from h1 moves to d1, and now black's rook is attacked too many times and gets taken on the next move. We see here an example of the strength of coordinated, or connected, rooks. Sometimes one can replace the other, increasing the power directed at a target in unexpected ways. Black to move. What is the best move? Black pins the white rook on c5 with his queen. But the pinned piece is attacked twice and protected twice, making it hard to see how black can capitalize. Try our new strategy. Consider whether an exchange or two might then make it possible to will other pieces onto squares where they can add pressure to the pinned position. The first exchange that suggests itself to black is rook takes rook, to which white replies queen takes rook. The swap has created a new target, but more importantly it has cleared the way for black to add a third piece to the action with our pawn from b8 moves to c8. White's queen is pinned, so its only recourse is to go down in flames with queen takes queen. At first this might seem to leave things awash when black recaptures pawn from a7 takes queen, but there is a better reply. Black plays rook takes rook, check. This requires white to spend a move avoiding the check, then black plays pawn from a7 takes queen. In effect the white queen was pinned to the loose rook behind it as well as to its king. Black's sequence here is an illustration of the correct use of the priority of check. If your opponent captures, sometimes it is best to hold off on the recapture and do any other damage you can that will inflict a check on his king. The recapture you postponed will still be there after the enemy has evaded the check, and in the meantime you will have taken more material than if you had recaptured right away. The position also shows again, of course, how a preliminary exchange of the pinned piece for a replacement can free up resources and allow you to put more pressure on the pinned position. Finally, here as in the previous position we see how two coordinated rooks are especially useful for that task, as one steps into the shoes of the other. Black to move. What is the best move? Now for cases where the pin must be created before worrying about whether the target can be brought down. In this case the possibility of a pin for black here is not obvious. White's king is not in line with any of its pieces. But if you are systematic about considering any checks black can give and their consequences, you see that there is just one to examine here. Rook moves to e1, check. White's only legal reply is king moves to h2. Imagine this and see that the rook on c7 would become pinned by the king's move. Now ask whether you would be able to exploit the pin by taking the rook. It would be protected once, by white's queen, and attacked once, by black's queen. You want to attack it more times than it is defended, but how? With our pawn from e1 moves to c1 moving the rook that just gave check to put more pressure on the pinned piece. It would be easy to overlook rook moves to c1 by staring at the board, Because you might forget that by the time white moves his king, black's rook now would be at the other end of the board and ready for action on the first rank. When you imagine a move during a sequence, be scrupulous in seeing it vacated from its old square and on the new one, and in considering what new powers it would have once those moves have been made. Note that when you are trying to build pressure against white's rook, one answer would seem to be knight moves to a6. It doesn't work, because white can reply queen moves to c8, check. Remember, black no longer would have a rook at e8. Black then has to fend off the check by playing queen takes queen, to which white replies rook takes queen, since the pin has been dissolved, or black can move his king or interpose his rook at e8, and then white is the one who plays queen takes queen, again achieving an exchange of queens rather than losing a piece. These aren't problems if black instead plays rook moves to c1, because then black has two pieces bearing down not only on the pinned piece but on the position white's queen might be tempted to take. This takes some careful thought to see. The general lesson is that when you have more than one piece that can be used to gang up on a pinned target, don't rush to use the obvious one. Think about the side effects each of your choices would have, whether moving one rather than the other would leave something loose, or create a bad open line, or as here would create more defensive options for your opponent. Ask what his best reply move would be after each of the moves you are considering, and whether they would be equally strong. Black to move. What is the best move? Once again, the first order of business is to create a pin. Black scans the lines leading from white's king and finds no useful targets, so he considers checks he can inflict and their consequences. He has one with his rook and a few with his queen. The most natural queen check to consider is queen moves to f3, check. Both because it is safe and because it combines the attack on the king with an attack on the loose bishop at e3. The move forces white to reply bishop moves to f2, as this blocks the check and also allows the king to protect the bishop. If white instead moves his king, he forfeits the bishop. This is the difference between queen moves to f3, check, and, say, queen moves to f5, check. It's a study in the usefulness of seeing loose enemy pieces. So the bishop interposes and immediately is pinned, and the question now is whether it can be taken down. Both sides will rush pieces to the scene of the pin. The question is which way the balance of power will tip once each side's resources are exhausted. Black's first move is rook moves to f8. Moving the rook behind the queen effectively means that white's bishop is attacked twice. It is important to realize that one way to increase pressure against a target often is by adding another piece behind the one inflicting the pin. Indeed, since the king is the bishop's only guardian, black's threat is even greater. Queen takes bishop would now be mate. Next question, how can white beef up the bishop's protection? He has two pieces left, his queen and rook. The queen moves to b6 and again the forces are balanced, the bishop is attacked twice and protected twice. So black throws yet another piece at it with knight moves to g4, where the knight takes the square that black's queen originally occupied. White is out of answers. He can't get his rook into position in time to be helpful. The bishop is attacked more often than it is guarded, and must be lost. Black will take it with his knight on the next move. Okay, now backtrack a minute. When black played rook moves to f8 on his second move, he also had the option of adding to the pressure by playing his rook from d8 to d2. but this would be less favorable. The short reason why is that rook moves to d2 leaves black's back rank bare, which thus allows white to reply with check. Rook moves to b8, check. Black can block the check by interposing his knight on g8, white takes it with his rook, and black recaptures, and now white has another check with queen moves to c8. At this point white has to be careful not to give black a move he can use to play. Rook moves to d1, checkmate. He has left his own back rank bare. Things can get messy here if the black king tries to run, but black's more likely play is queen moves to f8, blocking the check. After white forces an exchange of queens, black ends up ahead. The exchange not as good a result as we saw in the main line. Even without working out all these details, though, you should be able to see that on principle it's probably better to let the d8 rook do its work while staying on the back rank, i.e., by going to f8 rather than d2, and not leaving the king open to attack. So, 1. Queen moves to f3, check. 2. Bishop moves to f2, rook moves to f8, 3. Queen moves to b6, knight moves to g4, followed by knight takes bishop. White to move. What is the best move? Here is a little study in failure. See black's pieces lined up on the long diagonal and you naturally consider queen moves to a1. This position is similar to one we saw very early in our study of basic pins. At first it looks like the result is a relative pin of black's rook to his knight, as the knight is loose. But black can both move the rook out of the way and add its protection to the knight with rook moves to d6. That's not a reason to give up. The knight still remains pinned, this time to its king, so the position has turned into a new challenge. Since the knight is then attacked once and guarded once, consider whether you can throw another attacker at it. All you have for the purpose are pawns, so imagine marching them forward and what countermeasures black would have available. You start with pawn from g3 moves to g4, to which black must reply pawn from f5 takes at g4, now you have pawn from h3 takes at g4, planning to play pawn from g4 moves to g5 next and then take the knight a move later. But black isn't done. He responds to pawn from h3 takes at g4 by playing pawn from h7 moves to h6, and now he is ready to take your pawn when it steps forward to g5. Black thus saves his knight, which means white's original idea of queen moves to a1 doesn't win any material after all, though it probably remains white's best move because of its positional consequences. White to move. What is the best move? Using checks to separate the king from the target. When you pin a piece to the enemy king, the king not infrequently may protect the target against capture. In that case you sometimes can loosen the target by throwing a check at the king to drive it away from guard duty. The cue to look for, and to notice in each of the next positions, is a piece not only pinned to its king but on a square adjacent to it. In this first example white again starts with a pin, this time of black's knight on f6. Count the attackers and defenders of the pinned piece. There are two of each, so the knight seems safe, but it isn't. The pinned piece is adjacent to its king and receives important protection from it, a type of protection that tends to be unstable. To exploit the situation, white just needs to get a piece within harassment range of black's king. His rook would be ideal, but its path to the action is blocked by white's own knight on the e-file. We've seen a way to deal with this, though: clear the white knight out of the way by letting it take the pinned piece, as with knight takes knight. This is a powerful move, since it not only takes a piece but threatens the fork knight takes bishop, which also would be a discovered check against black's king. So black must take the knight, and the only piece he can use for the purpose is his queen. Once black plays queen takes knight, his queen has interposed its way into a pin. It's a shaky pin, as the black queen is guarded and can take white's queen with impunity if given a chance to do so. But white doesn't give him the chance. Having cleared a path for his rook, white brings it to bear not on the pinned piece, but on the piece protecting it, i.e., the king. Rook moves to e7, check. Requires black to move his king away from the job of guarding his queen. Queen takes rook obviously is out of the question for black. Remember that a piece pinned to its king can do no defensive work. Black plays his king to the back rank, and white has queen takes queen on the next move. The point: when a pinned piece is protected by its king, a check may suffice both to remove its protection and to keep your opponent busy answering your moves. It's worth some labor, i.e., making some threats and exchanges to create avenues for such a check. White to move. What is the best move? White's queen is under attack by black's queen and has no protection. The question is what white should do about it. Any checks you can give with your queen have to be examined in any event, and here white can administer check on the long diagonal with 1. Queen moves to e4. You further see that the black king is terribly constrained. The rook on a8 cuts off the entire 8th rank, so it has no flight squares. It's as if the king were stuck in the corner of the board. This means that in reply to queen moves to e4, black will have to interpose his queen at g6 to block the check. An interposed piece is a pinned piece. Think about how to capture it. The difficulty, common enough when a pin arises this way, is that the king itself guards its queen. The natural answer is another check to drive the king away. White has a resource for the purpose in his rook. He plays 2. Rook moves to a7, check. If black moves his king to g8, white has 3. Queen takes queen, check. And then uses the queen to mate on the 7th rank a move later. If black's king instead goes to h8, white still can play queen takes queen, not a check, and then mate soon, after black exhausts a feudal check or two at the other end of the board. Or, better, white can go with 3. Queen takes at e5, check. Holding the initiative, queen moves to f6, 4. Queen takes queen, check. King moves to g8, 5. Queen moves to g7, checkmate. Notice that black also can start by interposing his knight at f5 rather than using his queen, but then white just renews the check with queen takes knight, and this time black is left with no alternative to queen moves to g6. The two queens then are faced off on adjacent squares, but it makes no difference. White still plays rook moves to a7 and play proceeds as explained. One final thing, on white's second move it might naturally have occurred to you to play the rook check rook moves to h8 rather than rook moves to a7. This still wins a queen for a rook, but it has to be considered a blunder since it blows the chance for mate. When you need to give a check, be sure to consider whether there is more than one way to do it. White to move. What is the best move? This one is harder. White starts with his rook pinning black's bishop. The bishop is attacked once, by white's rook, and guarded once, by black's king. The king is a weak guardian because if it is attacked it very often has to move, it can't just be protected. The side of black's king and the pinned bishop flush up next to each other, thus should get you thinking about ways to loosen the bishop by driving the king away. Here white can use a check for the purpose. He plays rook takes at g7, check. Black replies king takes rook, and now the bishop is loose, allowing rook takes bishop. But this trades a rook for a bishop and a pawn, not a great deal. Can it be improved? Yes. White precedes the above sequence with pawn from f2 moves to f4. Consideration of this move by white is compulsory. You always ask whether you can attack a pinned piece with a pawn. Here black would answer with rook takes at f4. This is interesting, for it leaves the rook attacked once by white's king and protected once by black's bishop, which is the pinned piece, and is about to be lost. Now white plays rook takes at g7. After black plays king takes rook and white plays rook takes bishop, check. Black has to spend a move avoiding the check, and this gives white time to take black's rook with his king. It's a classic use of the priority of check. In effect, that initial move pawn from f2 moves to f4, and the capture of the pawn by black, gave white a kicker to play at the end of the sequence that made the whole thing worthwhile. This position illustrates in simple form how a check can drag the king away from a pinned piece that it is supposed to be guarding. The more challenging lesson is to see the importance of considering every way of attacking the pinned piece and the consequences that would follow from it. At first blush, pawn from f2 moves to f4 looks futile because of rook takes at f4, but on closer examination this is seen to leave the rook vulnerable to capture. White to move. What is the best move? Now a still harder one. White already has the black bishop pinned on the 8th rank. If he takes it with his queen, the queen is lost to queen takes queen. Knight moves to e7, check. Is the more interesting move, because it attacks the pinned piece and also gives check. If black moves his king in reply to knight moves to e7, playing king moves to f8, he loses the bishop since it is attacked twice and protected just once. So he needs to capture white's knight. Could he do it with knight takes knight? No, because if you imagine the board with both of those knight moves made, you will see that they would open a line from white's bishop to black's queen, allowing bishop takes queen. In effect, white's move knight moves to e7 leaves black's knight pinned to his queen. The remaining alternative for black is queen takes knight, which allows queen takes bishop, check. Apparently an exchange of minor pieces. But white's capture of the bishop also imposes a check on black's king, so we must consider the consequences. The king can't flee to h7 because white's bishop guards the square. Black has no choice but to interpose his queen on the back rank. The only way for him to do this is with queen moves to f8, since then the queen enjoys protection from the king. Moving the queen instead to e8 or d8 results in queen takes queen, checkmate. Now what? The point to recognize is that by interposing in this way, black's queen has pinned itself. It is attacked once and protected once, and so seems safe, but since its only guard is the king, black is highly vulnerable to a check. White has one piece left for the purpose, he plays bishop moves to h7, check. Black has no choice but to play king takes bishop, which leaves the queen loose. White takes it on the next move. White to move. What is the best move? The key thing for white to notice is that black's king and queen are together on the same diagonal with white's queen bearing down on them from b2. There isn't yet a pin because white's knight is in the way, but the potential is there. At first it's not clear what white could do with the pin, but he is familiar with the concept of the previous positions. If his queen pinned black's queen and black's queen were protected just by his king, then a check of the king perhaps by a rook, as in the previous position, would leave the queen loose, an easy prey to a capture. With that general idea hatched, the rest is a matter of identifying obstacles and eliminating them. The problems are that, a. There is a black pawn on c4 blocking the c2 rook's path to the 7th rank, b. If the rook were able to reach c7, there still would be a black pawn on f7 that would block the rook's path to the king, and, c. White's own knight blocks the pin, as we have seen. The first problem can be dealt with simply. The easiest way to clear an enemy pawn is by taking something it protects, so white plays rook takes knight, black replies pawn from c4 takes rook, and our first obstacle is gone. Now what of the black pawn on f7 and the white knight on d4? Pairs of problems like this should cause you to ask whether they can be eliminated together. Move the knight to a square the bothersome pawn protects, and perhaps they both will end up out of the way. Thus white plays knight moves to e6, check. Which forks black's rook and king and also unmasks the pin of black's queen by white's. If black moves his king, his queen is lost to queen takes queen. So black instead plays pawn from f7 takes knight. Now all three of the obstacles listed earlier have been eradicated. White can play rook moves to c7, check. Forcing black to move his king and leave his queen to be taken with queen takes queen. This position is a good study in the value of seeing an idea suggested by a pattern and then calmly removing the impediments to it one by one. The pattern is the potential pin of a queen adjacent to its king. The idea is to push the king away from the queen so the queen can be taken for free. The impediments are the three obstructions on the needed lines. As we see, they can be eliminated with forcing moves that give black no time for counterplay. Black need not take the bait, of course, he does not have to recapture after white's initial rook takes knight. White gains in any event. White to move. What is the best move? The cross pin. We have seen that a bishop can't be effective in pinning another bishop. The most common way to deal with this problem is by exchanging the pinned bishop for a better target. But there is another way as well. It may be possible to impose a second pin, a cross pin, against the pinned piece, so that it can't afford to capture the piece that pinned it the first time. These examples will clarify the point. In the frame to the left, white has black's bishop pinned to his king. This type of position generally would arise when black has interposed his bishop to fend off a check. Black's bishop has protection, so playing bishop takes bishop, check, doesn't get white anywhere, and meanwhile black threatens to win a piece by playing bishop takes bishop himself next move. White can't exchange the bishop for a better target, but he does have the possibility of a cross pin. The point to see is that black's bishop is on the same diagonal with its queen as well as its king. White takes advantage of this with queen moves to h7. Now the bishop is pinned twice, and both pins are doing important work. The bishop can't take the queen because then his king would be exposed. He can't take white's bishop because then white would play queen takes queen. Nor, of course, can the bishop run someplace safe. It's attacked twice and protected just once, so it is lost next move to bishop takes bishop. Black to move. What is the best move? What will white play in reply? You might reasonably worry about queen takes bishop a3. But remember that when you have a cross pin like this, either of your pinning pieces can capture the pinned piece and give check at the same time. That's important because check sees the initiative from your opponent. If white does play queen takes bishop a3, black thus has queen takes bishop, check. White is forced to play king moves to a1, and with black's queen and bishop now lined up, queen moves to b1, checkmate. Then is mate. Black to move. What is the best move? A rook has as much trouble pinning an enemy rook as a bishop has pinning an enemy bishop unless, that is, the enemy rook is pinned twice. Here white's rook is pinned by black's. The white rook looks safe enough because it has protection from its queen, but this protection turns out to be white's undoing. It causes black to ask whether the rook can be pinned to its guard as well as to its king. He plays queen moves to d2 and now white's rook is stuck on its square. Any move it makes will expose either white's king or queen to capture. The rook is attacked twice and protected once, so black will be able to bring it down next move with rook takes rook, check. Your only worry is that white might be able to disrupt all this by replying to black's queen moves to d2 with queen moves to d8, check. We've seen this general risk before. A problem with pinning something to your opponent's queen is that the queen may be able to make a threat or capture that wrests away the initiative. In this case queen moves to d8, check, would force black to move his king, and if white's queen could safely keep the king on the run, it could unpin the rook on d3 and thus allow it to play rook takes rook, since the rook at b3 would have been left loose. But once black replies to queen moves to d8, check, with king moves to h7, white is out of options. Black to move. What is the best move? Black pins white's bishop to his king with the rook on g8. But the bishop is guarded twice, by white's rook and queen, not by the f2 pawn, which is pinned, as well as attacked twice, so it's hard to see how black can exploit the situation. Part of the answer will be familiar from our earlier work. Black can bring another rook to bear on the pinned target by using his first rook to capture. He plays rook takes bishop, check. White replies rook takes rook, and now black has caused white to expend one of his guards while making room to bring another attacker into play with rook moves to g8. The pinned piece has been turned into a rook that is attacked twice and protected only once. The only apparent hitch is that black's rook is pinning white's rook along the g-file, which seems to invite white to break out of the pin with rook takes rook. He can't, though, because the rook on g3 is cross-pinned. If it moves up the file, black plays queen takes queen. The potential for this second pin of the rook was in place from the beginning. It just was blocked by the presence of white's rook between the pinned bishop and its queen. By playing one black rook takes bishop, black forced white into the cross pin. White will lose a piece. Actually, there are some complications that can now arise, but they all involve losses for white and are beyond the scope of this study. White might try pawn from f5 moves to f6, check. Black can play knight takes at f6, inviting queen takes knight, check. From white and then recapturing king takes queen. White has rook takes rook, and the result is that black has a queen against white's rook. The lesson to take away is just that a crosspin sometimes can be created using the same logic and techniques used to create initial pins here, by consolidating three enemy pieces into two with a capture. White to move. What is the best move? White's queen pins black's queen sort of. The black queen is free to move along its diagonal, and to play queen takes queen, it just can't move off the diagonal. Since the target is protected once and guarded once, the pin does not yet appear to be effective. But white can change that by throwing another attacker at the pinned piece with rook moves to d1, a cross pin. Yes, black still can play queen takes queen, but this has become costly because now white has the reply rook takes rook, check. And then, after black moves his king out of check, white still has the recapture pawn from b3 takes queen, using the priority of check to gain material. The key to seeing the solution here is to notice, first, that the pinned piece is aligned both with its king and with another piece that makes a good target, and secondly that the loose piece that is the second target is aligned with its king. This means that capturing it will create a check, which in essence gives white a free move as black has to spend his time on evasive maneuvers. The free move is critical because black's initial queen takes queen is so costly. The sequence only works for white if he can avenge it and pick up the rook on d8. White to move. What is the best move? The pattern here is similar to the previous one but with an important difference. Again white's queen pins black's, and again white can add a cross pin by moving his rook onto the enemy queen's file. Our pawn from e1 moves to c1. Notice two things. First, white's queen enjoys no protection. Black can play queen takes queen without worrying about having his queen recaptured. Second, the reason white is comfortable allowing this is that if black plays queen takes queen he is threatened with worse than rook takes rook, he is threatened with rook takes rook, checkmate. Mate. Since white's other rook seals off the 7th rank, black's king has very little mobility and is vulnerable along the back rank. The basic idea of throwing another piece at the queen, and pinning it to a secondary target, is unchanged, but the power of the crosspin is much greater here. We saw earlier that a piece pinning the queen normally requires protection. This position shows an exception to the principle. If you can add a crosspin against the queen it may become too costly for your opponent to use it to attack the piece inflicting the original pin. White to move. What is the best move? Black has just interposed his queen between his king and white's queen. White momentarily has black's queen pinned, but he will have to act fast to make anything of it. Black is ready to play queen takes queen, and even if white guards his queen, say, with rook moves to c1, the resulting exchange will wipe out the pin and any potential it held. When your queen pins your opponents this way, a first thought should be to aim another piece at, and through, the pinned queen, so that queen takes queen becomes more costly for your opponent to play. The natural method here would be to move the rook over with rook moves to b1. This might not look like much, since it just positions the rook to attack the pawn on b7 if black moves his queen, but of course the real significance of the threat is that it targets the b7 square, which is adjacent to black's king and already attacked by white's knight. So if black plays queen takes queen, he suffers not just rook takes at b7, check, but rook takes at b7, checkmate. Mate. It's our now familiar concept. Rook moves to b1 crosspins black's queen to a mating square. Black can avoid immediate doom by replying to rook moves to b1 with knight moves to d7, which protects his queen and gives his king a flight square. But then white plays queen moves to f5, preparing to take black's knight on its new square. It's a little surprising to see white move his queen away, but this turns out to be surprisingly effective. First, notice that white really doesn't need his queen on c5 to pin the black queen anymore. White's rook has the situation under control. If black moves his queen, rook takes at b7, check. Follows for white, with the knight on a5 giving cover, and then black either loses the queen or gets mated. But if black doesn't move the queen and lets white play queen takes knight, he also has to worry about white's queen then adding to the mating attack against b7. And meanwhile from f5 the queen protects the b1 rook against queen takes rook, check. By black. All black can do in reply to queen moves to f5 is guard his knight with rook moves to d8 and permit white to play rook takes queen. It avoids the immediate threat of mate, but after black recaptures, white has won a queen for a rook.